I've run a lot of races in my life. When I was young and in high school, I joined a team called the cross country team. For those of you who don't know what cross country is, it's a running team that doesn't run on a track, but it runs out through the fields or through the mountains, and so you're out in nature. I always felt anxiety before one of these runs, before either a practice or even before a race. I remember worrying all day long, sometimes actually feeling sick to my stomach as I was preparing for it, then going through the race. Inevitably, at the end of the race, I would finish and I'd feel sick, physically sick from exertion, and then I'd go home exhausted, and then like the shampoo instructions, which is rinse and repeat, I would start the whole process again. And that evening, I'd start thinking about the next race and stressing about the next anxiety process, and through running, and all of these things became a burden for me. And so my senior year, I did this from my 8th grade year through my junior year. My senior year, I decided to play golf. I felt like the stress of running was enough for me. I didn't want to continue that, and so I set that aside. After that, I only ran a few races. I continued to run, but I only ran recreationally. And when I ran recreationally, I didn't have that same anxiety. I didn't wake up in the morning and think, oh, I'm going to go for a jog this afternoon, and I'm all stressed out about it. The night before, when I was thinking about exercising the next day, I didn't have a pit in my stomach. I rarely felt sick when I ran recreationally because I was not pushing myself. I wasn't pushing myself because there was really nothing when you run recreationally at stake. There's no reason to push yourself beyond your limits. No real reason to do that. In the passage we're going to look at today in Hebrews chapter 12, the author compares life to a race. It's not an unusual comparison in literature, and it's not an unusual comparison when we think about our own lives. I think it's easy for us to understand life as a race. So some people know about life being a sprint, and others would say, no, life's not a sprint, it's a marathon, and you have to think long term. So this concept of comparing life to a race, I think, is something that we can identify with. My goal in life as a race is that it's a recreational run. I think most of us would say we want our lives to be a recreational run. I'm not interested in feeling sick at the end of the day. I don't want to stay up at night worrying about the race that I'm going to run tomorrow. I don't want to stress out all day anticipating all the problems that I'm going to face when I have to race this run or run this race. I'd rather be thinking, it's going to be a nice jog today. And I'm just going to kind of cruise through the day. I'm going to run in the woods. I'm going to run along the Corniche down by the Mediterranean Sea, which is a nice run to have. I'm going to run on the beach. I'm going to fulfill my duty to the proverb that says, stop and smell the roses. I mean, after all, it's a command, right? So I feel I have an obligation to fulfill that proverb, to stop and smell the roses. And it has to be a recreational race in order to fulfill that. But unfortunately, life is a race that sometimes moves us from what seems to be a recreational race right into an actual race. There are moments when you're just cruising along, and then all of a sudden, the game is on. All of a sudden, the dynamics change, and you have to respond, and all the anxieties of that type of competitive race resume, and it becomes difficult to deal with. And when I think about that, I look back at my experience in running races or being on teams and having to participate in sports and the anxiety that was connected to that. And I wonder if there was any value just in that process in preparing me for life in general, how to anticipate these things, how to overcome these challenges and continue to move forward. Hebrews 12 reminds us that God understands this. He understands that life is a race, and he understands the anxiety that's connected to it, I believe, and that Jesus particularly understands this, and that he's run a pathway in front of us that can motivate us to keep running as he did. No matter what the circumstances are, no matter how quickly the race turns from a jog to a competition, Jesus understands what we're going through. So in Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, just in these two verses, it sums up this whole theory, this whole thesis that I'm presenting to you. And that says this: therefore we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. There are three clear points that he brings out here. Number one, when we think about running a race, we think about preparation. He says here, therefore we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, and here's the preparation point, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. That's preparation. No one who runs a race carries with them unnecessary weight. When I was in high school, I bought ankle weights that I would put around my ankles, and I would jump rope to try to increase my vertical leap so that I could jump higher when I played basketball. This is a common thing that we find athletes do. Or they do weight training and they will do squats with weights on their shoulders. But of course, it would be entirely nonsensical to take that with them into the competition. So when we compete, we set aside all of those. We lay aside every weight. And specifically, we lay aside the sins that ensnare us, the sins that entrap us. This is the worst burden that we have. Can you think of some biblical examples of men and women who were ensnared by particular sins? You probably can. I can think of several that had difficulties with sin. Take Solomon, take his father David, who had difficulties with sin that entrapped them, that ensnared them, and that became a weight, a noose on them, holding a weight over them, dragging them down, shackling them with these problems. Peter says the better approach in chapter 5, verse 7 of his first letter is to cast all your cares upon him, meaning God, for he cares for you. That's the better approach than bearing these weights. As we prepare to run the race that God has laid before us, the first thing we need to be careful of doing is shackling ourselves with unnecessary burdens, laying aside the weights that burden us down and the sin which easily ensnares us, he says, and then let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. We're going to come back to this concept of endurance, but it reminds me of what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 10, verse 22. And you will be hated by all for my name's sake, but he who endures to the end will be saved. That what Christ wants from us is not simply a sprint and then we're done, but a race that continues through our lives, in which we lay aside these weights, in which we don't allow sins to ensnare us and entrap us, but instead we endure to the end with him. It reminds me of another example in the Old Testament that gave a lesson on maybe about a year or so ago, and that's on Joseph. If you remember the life of Joseph, he ran a race with endurance. When opportunities for sin arose in his life of various types, he resisted and disciplined himself, maintained his focus. In fact, we're going to see here in a few minutes that the greatest example of endurance for us is Jesus himself, which is what this passage notes for us. If you're going to run well, don't burden yourself down with weights and with sin. Remove these things, is what the passage tells us. Number two, if you're going to run well, it's always nice to have someone around you inspiring you. Beginning of the passage says, therefore we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, Then lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us. Who are these witnesses? Well, this is Hebrews 12, following from Hebrews 11. And Hebrews 11 is a passage called the chapter of faith, which lists out a number of believers in the Hebrew scriptures and their faith. And so it then transitions into Hebrews 12, and this great cloud of witnesses are the examples that have come before us of people of faith. And they become our example. So we have this crowd of people, these crowd of examples for us that we can follow. So take what they've done and do likewise. So there are Old Testament believers who become examples for us, inspiration for us. We also have here Jesus Christ as the most inspirational example for us. The passage says, after, let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, at the end of verse 1, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. So we have witnesses from the Hebrew scriptures that are examples for us, but the true inspiration in our run is Jesus Christ himself. We are to look unto him, the author and finisher of our faith. Now, just as a translational issue here, you'll note in this particular translation that I have before you that it has our in italics. That means whenever you come across a text in which the word is in italics, it's the insertion of the translator trying to clarify the meaning of the text. Every translation is at one level in interpretation. So any of us who deal in multiple languages understand that we are engaging in an interpretive process as we translate. And sometimes in order to clarify a passage or something, we add something that doesn't seem to be, that's not there literally. Now, other translations would remove, and I think it's best to remove our. And instead of saying, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, we look unto Jesus, the author and finisher of faith. In the sense that Hebrews 11 speaks about men and women of faith who are looking forward to the coming of the Messiah, and now when the Messiah Jesus comes, that anticipation is no longer our faith. Our faith is looking back at Jesus, who's completed the work of God on the cross. So we no longer anticipate. We anticipate his second coming, his return, but we know who he is and we know how salvation is achieved in God through him. So looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of faith. How does Jesus inspire us? Well, he inspires us by challenging us to keep the commandments of God. He said in John chapter 15, verse 10, if you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. So our connection to God, we know spiritually, if you think about our series in Galatians, you'll remember that our connection to God spiritually is through Jesus. And this process is in what God has done in Christ. As Christ obeyed his commands, we receive his righteousness by virtue of our faith in him. So our connection to the Father, of course, is mediated through Christ. So then ultimately, we can identify with Christ's statement in Revelation chapter 1, verse 8, I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, who is and who was and who is to come, the Almighty. This is our inspiration. This is the inspiration for running this race. It reminds me of a story I've told before here, and that is when I was running in cross country one time. I was in the 9th grade, my brother was in the 12th grade, and because he is older than I am, he was always better than I was. So when we would run in a race, I would see him for maybe the first quarter of a mile, going further and further away from me, and then I would not see him until I crossed the finish line and he was there. Except for one race, when he was a senior, I was a freshman, and I remember coming around a corner down a hill, and I saw my brother kind of limping along. And clearly he had hurt himself somewhere in the race, and when I got up to him, our coach was there with him, walking next to him, and our coach would give us hints as we would run. He would say, you need to catch those two guys if we're going to get enough points to win the meet. So I would know that's my objective. And I remember as I passed Russ, and was running down. My coach was telling me, you need these two guys, these two guys. I remember distinctly, even until today, my brother yelling from behind me, "Catch him, Lyall!" And I caught him. Because sometimes when you have somebody there saying, "Let's go," that little push pushes you to go beyond what you normally would do. And while I was tired, knowing that my brother is watching and is encouraging me and compelling me to go forward inspires me. If we're going to run and we're going to run well, we need to prepare well. But we also need to recognize we need inspiration around us. And if we try to do it by ourselves, eventually we're going to struggle. The inspiration is crucial. That's exactly why we have here the author of Hebrews telling us we have these examples around you, and then you have Jesus Christ. Look to him, because he's the one saying, "Catch him, do it, keep going." He's the one yelling in our ear. Lastly, we run the race, and in order to run this race, there needs to be a certain degree of determination. We prepare well. We have the inspiration, the drive, the motivation to run. But once we're in the race, if there's no determination to continue, when things around us seem to be falling apart, then we'll quit. So determination and internal fortitude to keep going is essential if you're going to run well. The writer says this in verse 2, "Looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of faith," and this is what Jesus did, "who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God." So when we think about determination and running in a way that is clear and determined, it means maintaining a level of endurance, not giving up simply. And this is the first thing that it says of Jesus, who for the joy that was set before him did what? Endured the cross. So here's the goal. The end is the finish line. What is at the finish line? The joy of crossing and having your brother say, "Well done." The joy of crossing the finish line and having Christ himself say, "Well done, thou good and faithful servant." So Jesus went through the same exact process. For the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross. Part of this competition that we have in running is when pain and difficulties arise, we have to keep going. And part of running our race in this life is that when pain and difficulties arise, like Jesus endured the cross, we have to endure. It was never promised to us that this race would be an easy race. And the cross itself was notoriously vicious as a form of execution. That's why it says here he endured the cross. But more so than the physical pain of the crucifixion is the spiritual struggle that Christ went through. In fact, one of the most perplexing passages in all of the scriptures is Matthew 27, verse 46. When it says, "In about the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice saying, 'Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani,' that is, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And when we looked at this in a series at Easter, we noted that what Jesus may be doing here is referring to the Old Testament passage for which this is the first verse of that whole psalm. And what he's doing is referring to the whole psalm, which is ultimately a psalm of vindication, which is ultimately a psalm of victory, that God does see his children and will not forsake them. However, we also know that on the cross, Jesus took our sin. He who knew no sin became sin for us. And that isolation that occurred when Jesus took on our sin, the separation that occurred between him and the Father at that time, required the type of endurance that we must maintain when we face similar, or I should say, when we face our own difficulties. It would be false to say that we face a similar difficulty. We used to have, some years ago, a kids club here in Beirut. in this church, meeting right out. We'd play right out in the parking lot that's here to my left. And when we'd have this kid club, we'd play games and we would do Bible studies. And we had several kids. Sometimes we'd have 30 plus kids coming. Most of the time it was boys because the gentleman and I who are running this kids club both have 3 sons, and they would come and they would bring their friends, and almost all their friends, of course, were boys. So basically it was a boys club of about 30 kids at times. And I remember one time a 14-year-old boy, after going through a series on different passages in the Bible about the nature of Jesus, he asked me this: do you think it is better for someone to follow Jesus now? He was 14. Do you think it is better for someone to follow Jesus now or to wait until they're out of their home? As a 14-year-old boy, recognizing that if you make a step for Jesus and you accept Jesus, you may end up finding the same type of isolation that Jesus found when he was on the cross. And the concern about isolation and separation was something that he understood very well. And it broke my heart. Because what's the answer to that? What's the answer to that question? No, we don't seek isolation. I'm not calling you to pursue isolation. I don't pursue isolation. There's no innate virtue in experiencing isolation. I'm not a better believer than somebody else if I try to recreate isolation in my life. This is what ascetics, monks, monastics have done throughout history. By consciously going into isolation and separation, they're saying, I've achieved some type of level of spirituality beyond the others. I don't think we need to pursue this. I'm only a better believer through isolation if, when I'm confronted with it, I look to Jesus and I see his isolation on the cross. And in response, I refuse to give in to the external pressures that are mocking me or the internal pressure that is berating me and calling me to abandon it all and just stop on the side of the road and say, I can't go any further. Enough is enough. To avoid those natural inclinations and this inclination to embrace the easier alternative. That's when isolation creates something good in me. I'm not calling you to look for it. But you don't have to live very long to have lived there at some point. And when you're there, you can either determine to keep running, and you can look to Jesus who endured the cross for you, for me, or you can allow these pressures externally and internally to shut you down. Like Jesus, we're called to trust God's plan and to trust that the blessing, the joy on the other side, the joy that awaited him is worth the endurance. Number 2, when we think about determination, is not only endurance, which is a form of isolation in this sense, but also resilience. What's the very next phrase? He says, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him did what? Number 1, endure the cross. He says, secondly, despising the shame. What does despising the shame mean? Well, it means disregarding the shame. It doesn't mean necessarily, we think despising the shame, you think means hating the shame. But in fact, the context here and the nature of the term that's been translated here, despising, is probably more accurately understood as disregarding the shame, rejecting it. If we want to try to maintain despising, you might want to say, we have a phrase in English, to look askance at something. It's kind of an old phrase. It means to kind of look at it like you're rejecting it and turning away from it. This is kind of the image that is conveyed here. Jesus willingly bore the cross this supreme example of humiliation within his own culture. And furthermore, he made bearing that cross bearing that symbol of the cross a requirement for his disciples, that we are to bear a cross too. We're going to see a passage like that emphasizes this here in a moment. So when he says here that he disregarded the shame, I think what I want to convey to you is we have the aspect of endurance, enduring the cross, but then also a resilience. And I want to distinguish between the two in the sense of a physical challenge and a psychological or emotional or spiritual challenge. Because enduring the cross, I think in the context here, means he actually endured the cross. He suffered greatly for us. But despising the shame is not simply a physical thing. Despising the shame is dealing with the psychological, the emotional, and the spiritual consequences of all that. This is the resilience that's required. Some people, for instance, and it's very hard to quantify this, you can have people who train together and have essentially the same routines and seem to have the same level of endurance, but for some reason, one of them is able to push a little further. For some reason, one is able to find something in them and control their mind in order to keep going. This is the resilience that we find here. This is the resilience that allows us to continue down this pathway when we want to stop. What was the shame that Jesus faced? It wasn't simply the crucifixion. It was the mocking of the people around him. Think of the whole crucifixion story. Here's the Son of God, Jesus Messiah, who came to save these people from their sins. And what was their response? Mocking, accusing, criticizing, laughing, stripping him naked, humiliating him. It was humiliation. The cross was a sign of humiliation. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 1:23, "But we preach Christ crucified, to the Jews a stumbling block, and to the Greeks foolishness." So for both Jews and Greeks, it was a sign of humiliation and stupidity. Who would think that this was the pathway for God's plan among mankind? For the Jews, the cross didn't mean a great nation is going to come about. For the Romans, the cross didn't mean victory. For the Romans, the cross meant death. The exact opposite. Jesus he took on, he endured the cross, and he disregarded the shame that was associated with it for us. And we are to look to him as our example of resilience. That when he was humiliated, that we can that he understands what we go through when we struggle with shame. To a person of honor, like Jesus, the bearing of shame is probably one of the most difficult burdens to bear. Think about it in our own lives. When you find someone who wants to maintain a reputation of honor, one of the worst things that could be said about them is that they have shamed their name. When someone says, for instance, well, I don't care what others think, I'm just going to, whatever, do this, say that. It doesn't matter what everybody else thinks, I'm going to do my own thing. They best be aware of the rightness of their actions, because suppressing shame that is generated from people around us can be a destructive decision. On the other hand, living in shame over failures, over accusations made against us by others, over expectations that we have set for ourselves but have not achieved, over harmful ideas that we've created about ourselves, is equally destructive. Some of the shame that we feel is from others criticizing us, and some is because of false criticisms that we've generated in ourselves. And this shame is ugly and harmful, and God can heal us from that. The passage here is challenging us to understand a radical approach to bearing the shame of the cross. It's talking about the humiliation that Jesus disregarded, the shame that he paid no attention to, in order to fulfill his mission. It says in Luke chapter 9, verses 23 to 26, and he said to all, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will save it. For what does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses or forfeits himself? For whoever is ashamed of me or of my words, of him will the Son of Man be ashamed when he comes in his glory and the glory of the Father and of the holy angels. Jesus is saying, I've given this for you. You take up your cross and follow me, just as he took up his cross, and that with that may come some shame and humiliation. Paul said it this way, for I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it, in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. This is resilience, that when the world looks down on the believer for her stand for Christ, or for his position on righteousness, that this puts the believer in a difficult place. It's hard for us. And I remember, especially when I was starting off in college, I remember trying to live a life that honored God, but just feeling the pressure around me in the sense of shame. Or you believe this? You actually think that these myths are real, that you live your life according to these principles? I think many of us have been there. And this is what makes Paul's statement later on even more compelling. In 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 2, he says, for I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. Imagine that. The only thing I'm going to know is the thing that brings humiliation. It's the thing that people say, that's pretty weak, that's all you got? For me, there comes a point often in my life in which I have no other answers but the cross. I can't tell you why. I don't understand why, but all I know is that Jesus died for me and he endured the cross, despising the shame for my sake. And are we willing to bear the same shame of the gospel? Resilience. Disregarding the shame when you find yourself under attack, directly for your faith or subtly because of your faith, be resilient. Despise the shame. Remember the shame, the humiliation that Jesus overlooked, that Jesus ignored for you. And be resilient. Lastly, determination has a third component, which is what I've identified here as realization or vindication. The last phrase. Who, for the joy that was set before him, did three things: endured the cross, endurance, despising the shame, resilience, and lastly, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Realization. What I mean by realization is there comes a point in our lives in which we realize what our true identity is, what our true value is. Me as a runner, if I placed my identity and value in coming in first place, I would have been a total failure. Because in every race that I ran, I never came in first place. Not once. In a competitive race. In gym class here or there, maybe. But in an actual race that mattered, I never came in first. I actually don't know that feeling of being in a competitive race and winning. So if my identity was connected to winning in that sense, I would be a failure. Realization is understanding what your true value is. It's not tied to coming in first. It's tied to being used as a vital part of the overall game plan. And that the coach vindicates his selection of you to be on the team by valuing the role that you play. This is what good leaders do. This is what good coaches do in any environment. A good coach recognizes, or a good leader recognizes the worthiness of each individual in the group. I have this person here who can do this person here who can do that. And as we all work together, we perform a role and achieve a goal that is beyond the capabilities of any one of us individually. This realization that God is using me in a greater plan is exactly what we find here. That Jesus, for the joy that was set before him, endured the cross, despising the shame, and lastly, has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. This is vindication. Who is Jesus? Who is he really? Revelation chapter 5, verse 11 describes what the angels are saying even now about Jesus. Verse 11, then I looked, John receiving the revelation, and heard the voice of many angels around the throne, the living creatures and the elders, and the number of them was 10,000 times 10,000 and thousands of thousands, saying with a loud voice this, worthy is the Lamb who was slain to receive power and riches and wisdom and strength and honor and glory and blessing. And every creature which is in heaven and on the earth and under the earth and such as are in the sea and all that are in them, I heard saying, blessing and honor and glory and power be to him who sits on the throne and to the Lamb forever and ever. That's the vindication of Jesus. He endured the cross and despised the shame, so that when people looked at him and said, who is this? He said he could save others. Let him save himself, they said, right? But Jesus is vindicated in the end. And as it says in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 2, he has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God, proving who he truly is, realizing who he is. And the same thing should occur with us. As we determine to run well, we eventually understand God's plan for us. And it's great to look at Jesus and understand that his message, his objective, his identity is vindicated. He is who he said he was. Many at the time challenged him on it because he did not fulfill this role of being King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And they didn't see it this way, and they understood ultimate vindication and victory came through establishing authority. In fact, the well-known Roman historian Cicero in 56 BC said this. He said, we the Romans have surpassed all peoples and nations by piety. This almost sounds religious. It is. It almost sounds something like you would come out of the scriptures themselves. We have surpassed all peoples and nations by piety and religion, and by the one wisdom, that being our realization that everything is ruled and governed by the power of the gods. What proved the superiority, the greatness of the Romans? Cicero says, because we rule everything. We have surpassed all peoples and all nations by piety and religion, and the realization that everything is ruled and governed by the power of the gods. We are in control. Therefore, our system is right. Jesus died on a cross, and we say, where is his authority? Where's the proof that he is who he is? Well, the resurrection is our hope, but John's vision of where Jesus sits now confirms for us the vindication of his message, and that we can trust in that. As you run, I pray that you will realize that you have worth, and that God has selected you to bring you into this race with him, and that you're to look to Jesus, the author and finisher of faith, and you are to run because he inspires you to run. And you have to understand that just as God has vindicated his own Son, he vindicates us. He allows us to realize our true identity. Paul says it twice this way. Romans 8:37. Yet in all these things, we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. If you read the whole chapter in chapter 8, he lists out all the struggles that he's faced. And he says, in all these things, we are not just conquerors, we are more than conquerors. We have overcome all these things. Ephesians chapter 2, verses 5 through 6. Even when we were dead in our trespasses, he made us alive together with Christ. By grace you have been saved, and raised us up with him, and seated us with him in the heavenly places in Christ Jesus. What did Hebrews chapter 12, verse 2 say? That he's seated at the right hand of the Father, vindicated in his identity. And we, Paul says, are seated with him. That we are dead in our trespasses. We're made alive to Christ, and he has raised us up and seated us with him. So our realization of our true identity is connected to Jesus' vindication as Lord. I'm not simply the totality of the successes and the mistakes that I've made. I'm a child of God who's connected to God through Jesus Christ. And I can maintain my determination to run the race that God has laid for me because I know that I am more than a conqueror. I know that I will be raised up with the Lord and seated with him in heavenly places. This is the vindication. It's not a power here and now, as Cicero understood it to be, and that many still strive to achieve, but it's a realization that I am Christ's, Christ is God's, and we are one together. It's something that blows my mind that I can't entirely explain and I don't entirely understand. But I know it's the culmination of this race. And when I'm just jogging along, things are going okay, and I'm stopping to smell the roses, and then I continue on, and all of a sudden it seems like the world has just started to speed up, and now I need to run. If I don't remember three principles, well, let me say this. If I don't have a determination to continue, then I'm going to fail. But also, if I haven't set a foundation, even in my jog, even in the beginning process of preparation, this is where it starts. Preparing ourselves, laying aside sins, laying aside weights, laying aside wrong thoughts about who God is and about who we are, setting those aside, preparing myself well, and looking to people and Christ himself who can inspire me. And then when the race is on, we say, let's go. Let's run with determination, with endurance, with resilience, with a realization that God has chosen me to be on his team. And he understands why I'm there. And Jesus is now looking down at me and at you in the middle of all of your problems, and he's saying, go get him. Catch him, Lyall. Keep running. Don't stop. Because at the end, there's going to be joy when you cross the line and you're with the Lord. Our Heavenly Father, we come to you this morning. We ask that you would help us to run well. And that as we read passages like this, we would be challenged to never turn away from you, never to give up, but to continue to run, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of faith. We ask this all in his name. Amen.